The original Avengers team have all gone through some changes over the course of the Infinity Saga, but Thor might have had the biggest journey of them all. Biggest beer belly of them all for sure. A lot has been said about how Captain America went from a man looking for a grenade to fall on to finding something to live for, compared to Tony Stark going from self-interest to self-sacrifice, but the mightiest member of the Earth's mightiest heroes has had a pretty mighty growth all on his own. In fact, looking at where he started compared to where he ended up might be the biggest arc in the Marvel Cinematic Universe. Unlike other heroes who come to terms with their powers from being powerless, Thor starts with power and the privileges of royalty. He's not an underdog like Peter Parker or someone overcoming tragedy like Tony Stark and his lost parents. He's someone who's comfortable with his power, but instead has to learn how that power affects those around him. Like a proper Marvel story, he has to learn the responsibility of his power. Thor, by any measure, was a gamble for the fledgling MCU. Way back in 2008, when Iron Man announced the arrival of this new shared universe experiment, comic book movies were only just on the road to recovery. The trajectory of the superhero movie that started with Superman in 1978 had ended with bat nipples and Schwarzenegger one-liners with Batman and Robin.
The Iceman cometh!
The next successful reboot of Batman leaned heavily on so-called realism. In so much as a man dressing up like a bat and fighting crime in a city terrorized by a guy with a nightmare gas and a rag mask on his face could be realistic. Even the other Marvel properties that were sold off to keep the lights on eschewed comic book excess for reasonable realism.
What would you prefer? Yellow spandex?
For the record, yes, we would have preferred yellow spandex, Scott. Apple polisher. I'm not letting up on you, Cyclops. You hear me? I'm not letting up. Anyway, Iron Man split the difference between realism and the comic book looks like Sam Raimi's Spider-Man, which, organic web shooters aside, looked lifted from the comics. Rosemary Harris is in fact Aunt May. What does all this have to do with the mighty Thor? Thor was the fourth installment of the MCU, and there was a bit of concern about how you work in the literal Norse god of thunder into the realistic world of Iron Man. Enter Arthur C. Clarke. You might know Arthur C. Clarke as the author of 2001: A Space Odyssey, but he was also a futurist who first proposed the idea of geosynchronous satellites, used for global communication. He was a science fiction writer who made science fiction science. He proposed like any sufficiently advanced technology would be indistinguishable from magic to the observer. Like how your cat doesn't know why it can't catch that red dot. It's just magic, folks. So Thor started his time in the MCU as a technologically advanced society that were worshipped as gods by the people of Earth because they had their showdown with the frost giants in Norway. And this isn't the only important starting point for the MCU's God of Thunder. When we first meet Thor, he's brash, confident, and hot-headed. When the frost giants show up to steal the cask of ancient winters, well, to be fair, steal it back, Thor ignores his father's wishes and goes to confront Loki himself. Of course, this is all part of Loki's elaborate plan to win favor from his father he's about to find out is adopted. But unlike Loki's other tricks that require manipulation and illusions, for this plan, he just needs to find someone to fight and aim his hot-headed brother straight at it.
Run back home, little princess.
Dad.
And it works like a charm, for Loki. Odin, who was ready to hand the throne over to Thor, becomes so mad at his son, he sends him to Midgard without his supper or his favorite hammer, placing an enchantment on it that grants anyone who is worthy the power of Thor. Humbled and powerless, left only with the mortal strength of a jacked Chris Hemsworth, which for the most of us would count as enough of a superpower, Thor is faced for the first time to not only deal with something he can't smash with a hammer, but he has to consider for a moment how his actions affect and endanger others. When Loki finds out that the Warriors 3 and Lady Sif made their way to Earth to alert Thor to Loki's deception, Loki sends the Destroyer to kill them all. In order to save the town, Thor offers to surrender to Loki, a worthy act. This ends Thor's hammer timeout and brings back the God of Thunder in all his glory. Just look at that suiting up scene, it's awesome. Just like in real life though, lessons learned don't always mean a fresh new person the next day. When we next see Thor, he's still brash, all hammers and elbows, as he attacks the Quinjet carrying his captured brother Loki, clashing with the also arrogant Iron Man before Captain America intervenes. Oh, those poor trees. While his power is relatively small compared to Thor or the Hulk or even Iron Man, his heart and sense of right and wrong make up for the gap. It's Captain America's example in the Avengers, as well as Coulson's Sacrifice revoked by Tahiti, no one stays dead in the comics, enforces the lesson Thor needs to learn in Phase 1 of the MCU. It's not enough to be mighty. If you're not protecting those not as mighty, you are endangering them. Phase 2. Thor's second solo outing in the MCU stumbled before it began. While the first Thor movie was directed with Shakespearean flair by Kenneth Branagh, the second outing was meant to be directed by Patty Jenkins, who would later direct Wonder Woman for the distinguished competition. After Jenkins left over creative differences, television director Alan Taylor took over. That didn't mean there weren't some on-screen lessons for Thor to learn though. In the Dark World, Thor learns that his dad has his own demons to sort out. Malekith and the Dark Elves are using the convergence to, what else, get back something that Odin took from them to bring the 9 realms in line. In this case, it's the Ether, which just so happens to contain the Reality Stone. It's another lesson for the One-Day King about consequences, as Malekith's effort to get the Ether results in the death of Frigga, Thor's mom. It's a lesson for Loki too, who's connected with his adopted mother and learns his magic from her. The two brothers form an uneasy alliance to fight Malekith and avenge Frigga. But that alliance is of course short-lived, with Loki fakes his death once again so he can usurp the throne of Asgard. Again. The Dark World continues the idea of 1 foot in fantasy and 1 foot in reality, as Thor's girlfriend Jane Foster sciences up all of their magic when she gets infected by the Ether. But when Thor appears in Age of Ultron, magic gets a little bit of a kick. The question of worthiness comes up again at a We Beat Hydra rap party. Hawkeye doubts the hammer's enchantment, so the Avengers take turn testing their worth, with Captain America being the only one to move it even slightly. Are you in the camp that thinks he could have lifted but didn't want to show Thor up at the party? Or you're just in the camp that thinks in that moment he wasn't worthy because he was hiding the truth about Bucky and Stark's parents? While all of that is a device to set up the way for the Avengers to trust Stark and Banner's second super android, it wasn't the only development in Age of Ultron for the Thunderer. In a scene that may have been the only thing that forced Whedon to abandon the MCU, Thor was given a glimpse into the future and tasked with the important mission of finding the Infinity Stones before Thanos finds them. It's not growth specifically, but it does set up Thor's final chapter in the Infinity Saga and the biggest change in the MCU. The difference from Thor the Dark World to Thor Ragnarok is almost jarring. A lot of that is down to Thor's third director in as many movies, this time by the quirky New Zealand director Taika Waititi, who directed movies like Eagle vs. Shark and What We Do in the Shadows. This is a Thor who's been away from country life. Instead of living as the heir apparent in a land where people literally worshipped him, he's spent his time with mortals who are more willing to step up to defend those less powerful than themselves. He's on a quest to find those pesky Infinity Stones when Asgard's old enemy Surtur hips him to the fact that his dad isn't the one on the throne. Ah, Loki. He is the god of mischief after all. One of the themes in the Phase 3 movies is the sins of the father. Black Panther has to face the consequences of his ancestors' decision to isolate Wakanda, despite of what's happening to the rest of Africa. Ant-Man and the Wasp deals with Hank's earlier experiments and his disregard for consequences. Spider-Man has to come to terms with the legacy of Iron Man. Peter Quill finds out his dad is an evil planet that gave his mom cancer just so he wouldn't feel the need to visit Earth again. Okay, Quill, you win. For Thor, the issues of Odin's conquest comes to roost. It turns out his life was the only thing keeping Thor's big sis in check. Odin had exiled Hela, the goddess of death, because her aggressive conquering nature was a burden now that Odin wanted to transition from conqueror to benevolent monarch. When Odin dies and Hela arrives, she gets right to her big sister duties and breaks Thor's favorite thing. By this time in the MCU, though, Thor isn't living a cinematic universe in the Dark Knight's trilogy shadow. Master of the mystic arts Doctor Strange has not only entered the MCU,
So Earth has wizards now.
he's guesting in a Thor movie. The need to be coy about gods and magic aren't as important anymore. So now this Thor, who like T'Challa and Peter Quill have to deal with disappointment that their fathers are flawed just like anyone else, has to learn a final lesson about his power. And rock out to some Led Zeppelin, baby. Woo! In Thor, taking his hammer away took his power until he learned how to use it responsibly. Now with Mjolnir in pieces, just like my Gen 1 Optimus Prime. Thanks, Susie. Yeah, I told Mom. Thor has to learn his power didn't come from hammers. He wasn't the god of hammers after all, he was Thor, the god of thunder. Where in Thor, the idea of gods and science are danced around a bit. But by in this third movie, Thor's trading god quips with his goddess of death sister Hela.
You're just the worst.
This is Thor at his most powerful, but he still has a lesson to learn about power. He's not going to solve everything. In learning that Asgard is people, not a place, he learns the final lesson about what's important: people. Unfortunately, that's going to set him up for the biggest of falls. Thor had just settled into his role as leader, thinking he'd learned all the lessons he needed: compassion and responsibility. Unfortunately, Thanos shows up just in time to teach him the next lesson: dealing with failure. Thor is unable to protect his people from Thanos when he attacks them as refugees. When Thor goes to Nidavellir to get a Thanos-killing weapon, he hopes to even the score. after a grand entrance in Wakanda during Infinity War. Totally awesome! Thor had his big chance to avenge not only his people, but the brother he had lost as he had just started to have a relationship with. Though to be honest, Loki was always going to betray him again, but they certainly had reached a new understanding of each other. Despite Stormbreaker being everything it was meant to be, Thor fails when he doesn't go for the head. In the span of a few weeks, he's lost his father, his hammer, his homeland, half his people, his brother, and now in the final moment when he could have had revenge to stop Thanos short, he instead witnesses the snap. When Thor can't undo that, he beheads a still victorious Thanos and falls into a depression fueled by booze, Fortnite, and regret. In the final lesson, just like Odysseus, whose adventure starts when he has to make his way home, Thor's last lesson is when he brings his people home, that he does not have to be ruled by destiny. Rather than a birthright king, Asgard needs a leader suited for the job, while Thor has to find his own destiny. It's a transformation that means that Thor's story extends beyond the Infinity Saga as he steps out in the universe and rekindle things with Jane Foster, who it turns out is pretty darn worthy herself. And that's Thor's journey to godhood in the MCU. What's your favorite phase of Thor's growth? Let us know in the comments, and while you're there, why not subscribe to CBR? We won't even test your worthiness. Thanks for watching, and be safe.